The house at 21 Magnolia Lane stood like an elegant fortress in the heart of the suburban sprawl. Its manicured lawns and polished facade concealing the emotional turmoil inside. 17-year-old Clara Evans had called it home for the past 8 years, though home hardly felt like the right word. To her, it was more like a gilded cage. Clara's father, Thomas, had remarried shortly after her mother's death. Meredith was everything her father seemed to want: polished, refined, and unapologetically ambitious. But for Clara, Meredith was a relentless force of manipulation, quick to disguise her cruelty behind a veneer of charm. Meredith's latest scheme was her most humiliating yet. "A girl like you needs grounding," she'd said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "You're flighty, spoiled, and too accustomed to your father's wealth. You need to learn humility." Clara had grown used to Meredith's constant undermining, but this was different. Meredith had arranged for Clara to meet Jack, a quiet man in his late 20s, who worked as a sanitation worker. Clara had overheard the arrangement from the hallway. "It's perfect," Meredith had told her circle of friends. "She hates every second of it, and the scandal will keep her in line. After all, who else would want her after this?" Jack was an outsider to this world of wealth and pretense. While Clara initially bristled at the thought of the engagement, she noticed something unusual about Jack during their first meeting. He wasn't what she'd expected, not crass or unkempt, but calm, reserved, and unexpectedly articulate. His eyes, deep and observant, seemed to see through the facade of her family's life. The Evans family's dining room was an expanse of glass and polished oak. Meredith, impeccably dressed as always, presided over dinner like a queen, her perfectly coiffed hair unmoving even as she cut through her steak. "I've finalized the arrangements," she announced. "Clara and Jack will be married in 6 months. We'll have a small ceremony, tasteful but modest." Clara's fork clattered against her plate. "Married? You're not serious." Thomas, who had grown quieter and more complacent in the years since his remarriage, cleared his throat. "Clara, your stepmother has a point. This could be good for you, good for me." Clara's voice broke, her indignation cutting through the room's stifling atmosphere. "You're marrying me off, like I'm some kind of burden." Meredith smiled coldly. "Don't be dramatic, dear. Jack is perfectly respectable. It's time you learned to live without constant indulgence." In the weeks that followed, Clara felt her world narrowing. Her protests fell on deaf ears, and her friends distanced themselves. As rumors of the engagement spread, Meredith's influence seemed to touch every corner of her life, from the household staff to her father's friends and business associates. But Clara was determined not to let Meredith break her spirit. If she had to endure this charade, she would find a way to regain control of her life. Jack, too, became a source of curiosity. Though he was mostly quiet during their mandated outings, Clara began to sense there was more to him than his occupation suggested. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Clara found herself walking alongside Jack through the local park. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground. "I don't understand why you agreed to this," Clara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp, but there was an undertone of vulnerability. Jack looked at her thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes, life doesn't give us the luxury of choice. But that doesn't mean we can't make the best of what we have." His words lingered in Clara's mind long after their walk. Jack wasn't the crude, unrefined man Meredith had implied. He was a mystery, and Clara was determined to unravel it. Unbeknownst to Clara, Meredith had ulterior motives beyond humiliation. Her obsession with controlling Clara wasn't just about discipline, it was about erasing her from the family's picture. With Clara out of the way, Meredith's son from a previous marriage, Nathan, could inherit Thomas's fortune. Meredith's plan hinged on Clara's compliance, and the wedding was only the first step. What Meredith didn't anticipate was Clara's growing resilience and the secret Jack had kept hidden, one that would turn her carefully constructed world upside down. Late one night, Clara couldn't sleep. She wandered into the library, seeking solace among the leather-bound books that had been her sanctuary as a child. As she reached for a volume, she noticed a faint light from the driveway. Peeking through the curtains, she saw Jack standing by his truck, speaking in hushed tones with a man she didn't recognize. The conversation seemed intense, their gestures sharp and deliberate. Clara's heart raced. Who was Jack really? And what secret was he keeping that could unearth everything Meredith had worked so hard to conceal? Clara couldn't shake the image of Jack speaking with the stranger in the driveway. Who was he meeting in the dead of night, and why the secrecy? As the days passed, her curiosity grew into a quiet obsession. She found herself scrutinizing Jack's every move, looking for clues about the life he kept hidden. Her father, and Meredith, meanwhile, continued to tighten their control over her. Invitations to social gatherings vanished. Her phone was monitored, and her friends from school rarely called anymore. Clara felt like a prisoner in her own home, and the only reprieve from the suffocating isolation was the time she spent with Jack. One afternoon, Meredith summoned Clara to the sitting room, a place where conversations always seemed more like interrogations. Meredith sat with perfect posture, her fingers drumming against the armrest of the velvet chair. "I hope you've been preparing yourself," she said, her tone syrupy and condescending. "The wedding is only a few months away, and you've done nothing to make yourself suitable as a wife." Clara crossed her arms, refusing to rise to the bait. "Suitable for who? A man you've chosen to punish me." Meredith's expression hardened. "You should be grateful, Clara. Jack is a man of integrity, even if his station in life is humble. He's the kind of man who will teach you discipline and obedience, qualities you sorely lack." It wasn't the first time Meredith had spoken about Jack, as if he were a tool in her arsenal. But this time, Clara noticed something strange. Meredith's words were too deliberate, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Clara. The next day, Clara confronted Jack during one of their outings. They were sitting by a pond, the autumn leaves swirling in the water. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked bluntly. "Why are you letting her use you like this?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the water, his expression unreadable. "You think I don't have a choice," he said finally. "But maybe I do. Maybe I'm here because it's exactly where I need to be." Clara frowned. "That's not an answer." Jack met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe it's not a question I can answer right now." His evasiveness only deepened Clara's suspicions. She resolved to find out the truth, even if it meant confronting Jack directly. Later that week, Clara stumbled upon an envelope tucked into one of Jack's jackets. It was unsealed, the corner peeking out just enough to catch her attention. Inside was a letter written in neat, precise handwriting. The contents stopped her cold. "Jack, you've waited long enough. The pieces are in place. Once the wedding is over, she'll have no choice but to hand it over. Don't forget why you're doing this." There was no signature, but the implications were clear. Someone was orchestrating this arrangement from behind the scenes, and Jack was part of it. Clara's mind raced. Was Jack complicit in Meredith's scheme, or was he working against her? She tucked the letter back into the jacket, her hands trembling. One thing was certain. Jack wasn't the simple man he pretended to be. Meredith wasn't oblivious to Clara's defiance. She noticed the way Clara and Jack spoke in hushed tones, the way Clara's confidence seemed to be returning. Meredith couldn't allow it. She'd spent years crafting her position as the matriarch of the Evans family, and Clara's disobedience threatened to unravel everything. One evening, as Clara prepared for bed, Meredith appeared in her doorway. "Do you think I don't see what you're doing?" Meredith said, her voice low and dangerous. Clara stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Meredith stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're trying to ruin this arrangement. But let me make one thing clear, you're not as clever as you think. And Jack, well, let's just say he's not the man you think he is." The next day, Clara received an unexpected visit from an older woman named Elaine. She was the widow of a former business associate of her father, and though they hadn't spoken in years, Elaine seemed eager to talk. "I don't have much time," Elaine said, her voice urgent. "But you need to know something about Meredith." Clara's heart raced as Elaine revealed a chilling tale. Years ago, Meredith had been implicated in the sudden downfall of a rival family. The details were murky, but the rumors were damning: financial manipulation, blackmail, and whispers of a more sinister involvement. "Whatever she's planning, it won't end well for you," Elaine said. "Be careful, Clara. Meredith destroys anyone who stands in her way." As Elaine left, Clara felt a mix of fear and determination. The pieces were starting to come together, but she needed more answers. Jack held the key. The next morning, Clara woke with a renewed sense of urgency. Elaine's warning, and the cryptic letter from Jack's jacket consumed her thoughts. If Meredith had a history of destruction, and Jack was involved in some hidden plan, Clara needed to know the truth before it was too late. The house was eerily quiet as Clara ventured downstairs. Thomas had left for a business trip, and Meredith was meeting with her lawyer. For once, the air in the house didn't feel suffocating. Clara decided it was the perfect moment to confront Jack. Clara found Jack by the garage, inspecting the engine of his pickup truck. The sharp scent of motor oil filled the air as she approached. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Jack glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "About what?" She held his gaze, her voice steady despite the nervous tremor in her hands. "I found the letter. The one in your jacket. Don't deny it, Ty. No, someone is giving you instructions. What are you really doing here?" For a moment, Jack said nothing. His expression was unreadable, his silence heavier than any denial. Then he sighed, closing the truck's hood with a decisive thud. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said. Clara's pulse quickened. "Find out what?" Jack leaned against the truck, his demeanor shifting from guarded to resigned. "I took this job because I needed the money, yes, but it's more than that. There's something your stepmother has been hiding, something that could ruin your family if it ever came out." Clara's mind raced. "You're saying you're here to expose her?" Jack shook his head. "Not exactly. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out at the right time." Jack's words were cryptic, but Clara pressed him for more details. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Meredith's scheme wasn't just about marrying Clara off to humiliate her. It was part of a larger plan to gain control of the Evans fortune. "Your father doesn't know it," Jack explained, "but your stepmother has been draining his accounts for years. She's got offshore accounts, fake businesses, everything. The wedding is her way of forcing you out of the picture entirely. Once you're married and out of the house, she'll move forward with the final phase." Clara's stomach turned. "And what about you? Why are you going along with it?" Jack hesitated before answering. "Because I have my reasons. But you need to trust Mayim, not your enemy." Trusting Jack was a risk, but Clara realized she had little choice. If Meredith's plan succeeded, her family's legacy and her father's trust would be destroyed. Meredith's growing paranoia became apparent in the days that followed. She questioned the staff relentlessly, demanded updates on Clara's every move, and even restricted her access to the house's more private areas. Clara played along, pretending to submit to Meredith's authority while secretly plotting with Jack. Together, they began piecing together evidence of Meredith's crimes. Jack had access to documents and communications that Clara could never have reached on her own. And Clara used her knowledge of the household to uncover hidden safes and records. But Meredith wasn't the only danger. The closer Clara and Jack worked together, the more Clara began to notice the shadows in Jack's past. One evening, as they sifted through a stack of old invoices in the library, Clara decided to confront Jack about his own secrets. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "You're not just some random guy who got caught up in Meredith's scheme. There's more to it than that." Jack stared at her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You're right, there is more. Meredith didn't just hire me, out of the blue I volunteered." Clara's breath caught. "What? Why?" Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with emotion. "Because she ruined my family too. My father was one of the investors she destroyed years ago. When he lost everything, he didn't survive it." Clara's heart sank. Jack's calm demeanor had always hinted at pain beneath the surface. But this revelation changed everything. "I've been waiting for years to bring her down," Jack said. "And when I heard about her plans for you, I knew it was time." Jack's confession solidified Clara's resolve. Meredith's actions had destroyed more lives than Clara had imagined, and now she was determined to stop her. "We'll need proof," Clara said. "Something undeniable that will expose everything she's done." Jack nodded. "I have a lead, but it's risky." The lead was a set of documents hidden in a storage unit rented under an alias. If they could retrieve them, they would have the evidence needed to expose Meredith. But the clock was ticking, and Meredith's watchful eye made every move a gamble. The night they decided to retrieve the documents, Clara and Jack planned meticulously. They waited until Meredith left for a charity gala, knowing she would be distracted for hours. As they reached the storage unit, Jack used a set of keys he had acquired during his work for Meredith. The space was filled with neatly labeled boxes, each one holding potential secrets. Jack opened a file and handed it to Clara. "This is it. Bank statements, fake contracts, it's all here." But as Clara scanned the papers, she noticed something chilling. Her name? "This isn't just about my father," Clara whispered. "She's been setting me up too." Before Jack could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the unit. Someone else was there. Clara and Jack froze in the storage unit as the footsteps outside grew louder. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast long shadows across the rows of boxes, and Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "We have to go," Jack whispered, pulling her away from the files she was holding. "But these documents," Clara began, clutching the incriminating evidence. "We don't have time," Jack hissed. He grabbed the folder and shoved it into his bag, then gestured toward a narrow door at the back of the unit. This way, they slipped through the door and into the night, the cool air biting at their skin. Behind them, the faint sound of someone entering the unit sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "Who do you think it was?" Clara asked once they were safely back in Jack's truck. Jack's jaw tightened. "Could be someone working for Meredith, or maybe it's worse." Clara didn't want to ask what worse meant. By the time they returned to the house, Meredith had already returned from her gala. The sound of her laughter echoed through the halls as she spoke with someone in the sitting room. Clara and Jack exchanged a glance. "You get back to your room," Jack said. "I'll make sure she doesn't notice we're late." Clara nodded and crept upstairs, careful not to make a sound. As she passed the sitting room, she caught a glimpse of Meredith speaking with a man in a dark suit. His back was to her, but his demeanor was authoritative, almost menacing. Clara's curiosity got the better of her. She lingered just out of sight, straining to hear their conversation. "Still haven't secured the funds," Meredith was saying, her voice sharp. The man responded in a low tone, his words muffled. Meredith's response sent a chill through Clara. "If she becomes a problem, we'll deal with her the same way we dealt with the others." "Understood." Clara's breath caught. She hurried to her room, her mind racing. Who was this man, and what had Meredith meant by the others? The following morning, Clara couldn't shake the fear that Meredith's schemes were even more dangerous than she'd realized. As she stared at the documents Jack had taken, one file caught her eye: a series of transactions involving an offshore account linked to a shell company. "I think this is it," Clara said, showing Jack the file later that day. "Proof that she's been stealing from my father." Jack nodded, but his expression remained tense. "It's a start, but we need more if we're going to stop her." Clara's frustration boiled over. "How much more do we need? She's already ruined your family, and now she's trying to destroy mine. Why aren't we doing something?" Jack's eyes softened. "We will, but rushing in without a plan could get us both hurt or worse." Jack proposed a risky next step. They needed access to Meredith's personal files, stored on her computer in the office. Clara hesitated. The office was Meredith's sanctuary, a place she guarded fiercely. "How do we even get in there?" Clara asked. Jack smirked faintly. "Leave that to me." That night, Jack distracted Meredith by staging a minor accident in the kitchen. While Meredith berated the staff for the supposed oversight, Clara slipped into the office. The room was immaculate, every surface gleaming, and every object perfectly arranged. Clara felt a pang of unease as she sat at the desk and powered on the computer. "Come on," she whispered, typing in a series of passwords she'd overheard Meredith use in the past. On the fourth attempt, the screen unlocked, revealing a trove of emails and files. Clara worked quickly, copying as much as she could onto a USB drive. Just as she finished, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor made her freeze. Clara barely had time to hide the USB drive before Meredith entered the room. "What are you doing in here?" Meredith demanded, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. I was looking for a pen," Clara stammered, holding up the nearest writing utensil she could find. Meredith's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, Clara thought she'd been caught. But then Meredith smiled coldly. "Next time, ask." Clara nodded and hurried out, her heart pounding. Back in her room, she handed the USB drive to Jack. "I got it," she said breathlessly. Jack smiled for the first time in days. "This might be exactly what we need." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Meredith's web of lies was far more dangerous than they realized, then that time was running out to expose her. Clara and Jack huddled in the corner of her room, the USB drive plugged into a laptop Jack had brought with him. The screen glowed faintly in the dim light as file after file revealed the extent of Meredith's deceptions. "Look at this," Jack said, his voice low but intense. He pointed to a spreadsheet listing transactions tied to offshore accounts. "She's funneled millions into these accounts over the last decade." Clara leaned closer, her stomach sinking as she read the names of shell companies and forged signatures. "She's been stealing from my father, right under his nose," she said bitterly. "And he doesn't even see it." Jack's face darkened. "It's worse than that. Look here." He pulled up an email thread between Meredith and a man identified only as K. The messages were short and cryptic, but their meaning was clear. Meredith had been paying someone to eliminate potential threats to her schemes. "She's not just a thief," Jack said. "She's dangerous." Clara felt a growing sense of dread. She had always known Meredith was cruel and manipulative, but this was something else entirely. "She's destroyed lives," Clara whispered. "And now she's planning to destroy mine." Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to stop her. But we have to be smart about this. If we go to the authorities now, she'll bury us before they can even act." Clara nodded, though fear gripped her heart. They needed a plan and they needed to act fast. The next morning, Clara noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. The staff seemed tense, avoiding eye contact as they went about their duties. Meredith's voice, usually sharp but controlled, had taken on an edge of frustration. At breakfast, Meredith's eyes lingered on Clara for a moment too long. "You've been awfully quiet lately," she said, her tone sweet but probing. "I've just had a lot on my mind," Clara replied, forcing a smile. Meredith's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good. It means you're finally learning to think before you act." Clara excused herself as soon as she could, her pulse racing. Meredith was suspicious of that, Clara was certain. Clara and Jack knew they couldn't face Meredith alone. They needed someone on the outside who could help them bring her down. "What about Elaine?" Clara suggested. Jack shook his head. "She's brave, but she's not in a position to take on someone like Meredith. We need someone with influence, someone who can make people listen." Clara thought for a moment before an idea struck her. "My father's lawyer, Robert Turner. He's been with the family for years, and he's always been loyal to my dad." Jack hesitated. "If he's really loyal, we might be able to trust him. But if Meredith's gotten to him..." Clara nodded grimly. "We'll have to be careful." The following day, Clara arranged to meet Robert at a small cafe in town, away from the prying eyes of Meredith's network. Jack insisted on staying nearby, just in case. "Clara," Robert said warmly as she approached. "It's good to see you. Your father mentioned you've been busy lately." Clara forced a smile. "You could say that." As they settled into their seats, Clara took a deep breath and laid out the basics of what she and Jack had uncovered. She showed Robert some of the less incriminating files, careful not to reveal too much too soon. Robert's expression darkened as he scanned the documents. "If what you're saying is true, this is serious fraud, embezzlement, possibly worse." "It's all true," Clara said. "And I need your help to prove it." Robert hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window. "You understand the risks, don't you? If Meredith catches wind of this, she'll do everything in her power to discredit you." Clara's voice was firm. "I'm willing to take that risk. Are you?" After a long pause, Robert nodded. "I'll look into this. But you'll need to be careful, very careful." That evening, Clara returned home to find Meredith waiting for her in the sitting room. "Out for a little stroll, were we?" Meredith asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "I just needed some fresh air," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady. Meredith gestured for Clara to sit. "You know, Clara, I've been thinking about how stressful this engagement must be for you. Planning a wedding, adjusting to new responsibilities, it's a lot for a young woman." Clara forced a smile. "I'll manage." Meredith leaned forward, her expression softening into something almost maternal. "I only want what's best for you, dear. And if you ever feel overwhelmed, you can always come to me. After all, we're family." Clara's stomach churned. She knew better than to trust Meredith's sudden kindness. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "I've started digging. We need to talk urgently. Meet me tomorrow, same place. Relief washed over Clara. For the first time, it felt like they had a real chance of stopping Meredith. But as Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, a nagging thought crept into her mind. What if Meredith already knew what they were planning? In the darkness, a shadow moved outside her window. Clara sat up, her heart racing. Was it her imagination? Or was someone watching her? Clara barely slept that night, her mind plagued by unease and the lingering image of the shadow outside her window. By morning, she had convinced herself it was a trick of the moonlight, but the anxiety stayed with her. When she met Jack in the garden, she found him pacing nervously. He stopped mid-step when he saw her. "Did you hear from Robert?" Jack asked. Clara nodded. "He wants to meet again today. He said it's urgent." Jack frowned, his gaze flickering toward the house. "I don't like this. Meredith's been acting too calm lately. She might be onto us." "She knows something," Clara agreed. "But she doesn't know everything, not yet." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Then let's make sure Robert has what he needs. If we can get this to the authorities before Meredith makes her move, we'll stop her," Clara finished. But even as she said the words, a knot of doubt tightened in her chest. When Clara arrived at the cafe, Robert was already waiting for her, his expression grave. "Thanks for meeting me," Clara said, as she slid into the seat across from him. Robert wasted no time. He placed a thick envelope on the table between them. "I've reviewed everything you sent me, and I've started cross-referencing it with public records. It's worse than I thought." Clara's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Robert opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "Meredith isn't just stealing from your father. She's involved in a network of fraudulent companies that extend far beyond this family. Shell corporations, offshore accounts," and he hesitated. "What?" Clara pressed. Robert sighed, his voice lowering. "And she's using your name to launder some of the money. If this comes out, it won't just implicate her, it'll implicate you, too." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not possible. I've never signed anything for her." "She's forged your signature," Robert explained. "These transactions make it look like you're an active participant." The room spun around Clara as the enormity of Meredith's scheme became clear. She wasn't just stealing, she was framing Clara to take the fall. As Clara processed Robert's revelation, Meredith was busy weaving her next trap. She had sensed Clara's growing confidence in recent weeks, and her suspicions were confirmed when one of her contacts informed her of Clara's meetings with Robert. "She thinks she's clever," Meredith murmured as she reviewed Clara's recent activity on her phone, which she had secretly mirrored weeks earlier. "But I'm always one step ahead." Meredith's mind raced with possibilities. Clara's defiance had gone on long enough, it was time to make her pay. When Clara returned home, Meredith was waiting for her in the foyer. "How was your day?" Meredith asked, her tone light, but her eyes cold. Clara forced a smile. "Fine. I went for a walk in town." Meredith tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I hope you're not overexerting yourself. You've been looking stressed lately?" Clara's stomach churned. She muttered an excuse and hurried upstairs, but Meredith's words echoed in her mind. It felt like a warning, or worse, a threat. Later that evening, Clara shared what she had learned from Robert. Jack's expression darkened as she explained how Meredith had forged her signature to frame her for money laundering. "She's setting you up to take the fall," Jack said. "If the authorities come after you, she'll walk away clean." Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "We have to stop her before it gets that far." Jack hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small recording device. "I've been working on something. Meredith doesn't know it, but I've been recording every conversation I've had with her since the day I started working for her." Clara's eyes widened. "What do you have?" Jack played a snippet of one recording, Meredith's voice unmistakable. "Clara will never see it coming. By the time she realizes what I've done, it'll be too late." "This could be the proof we need," Jack said. Clara's relief was palpable, but Jack's next words sent a chill through her. "Meredith's not working alone," he said. "That man you saw her talking to, he's dangerous. If he finds out what we're doing, we could both be in real trouble." The next day, Clara and Jack planned to meet Robert again to deliver the recording. But, as Clara waited for Jack in the garden, she received a call from Robert. "Clara," Robert said, his voice strained. We need to talk. What's wrong? Clara asked, panic rising. There was a long pause before Robert replied, Meredith knows. Clara's blood ran cold. How? She confronted me this morning, Robert said. And she made it clear if I don't stop helping you, she ruined me, too. I'm sorry, Clara, but I can't be involved anymore. The call ended, leaving Clara reeling. She turned to find Jack approaching, his expression grim. What happened? He asked. Robert's out, Clara said, her voice shaking. She got to him. Jack cursed under his breath. We're running out of options. But before Clara could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. They turned to see Meredith standing at the edge of the garden, her arms crossed and a knowing smile on her face. Well, isn't this cozy? Meredith said. I think it's time we had a little chat. Meredith's sudden appearance in the garden was like a thunderclap. Clara and Jack froze, their secretive alliance exposed under the sharp gaze of the woman who had controlled Clara's life for years. Meredith's smile was icy, her poise unshaken. You've been busy, haven't you, Clara? Sneaking around, meeting with Robert, playing detective. I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you. Clara forced herself to stand tall, despite the fear bubbling in her chest. You don't scare me, Meredith. Meredith let out a soft laugh, the sound devoid of humor. Oh, sweetheart, you should be scared. You have no idea what you're playing with. Jack stepped forward, his voice firm. It's over, Meredith. We know what you've been doing everything. The fraud, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures. Meredith's smile faltered for a split second before returning, sharper than ever. And what do you plan to do with this knowledge? Run to the authorities. Go ahead. Let's see how far you get before they come after Clara for her involvement. Meredith turned her full attention to Clara, her tone shifting to something almost motherly. You poor thing, she said, shaking her head. You've let this man fill your head with nonsense. Jack, is it? Do you really think he's here to help you? Clara's breath caught. What are you talking about? Meredith's eyes glittered with triumph. Did he tell you why he's so interested in our family? Did he tell you about his father, and the little revenge fantasy he's been carrying around for years? Jack's face darkened. Don't listen to her, Clara. Meredith took a step closer. He's been using you, darling. He doesn't care about you, or your family. He just wants to see me fall, and you're the perfect pawn. Clara's gaze flicked between Meredith and Jack, her mind reeling. Is that true? Jack's jaw tightened. It's more complicated than that. Meredith laughed. Of course it is. Jack reached for Clara's hand, his voice urgent. Listen to me. Yes, I came here because of what Meredith did to my family. But everything I've done since I met you has been to protect you. Clara pulled her hand away, her voice trembling. You should have told me. I couldn't, Jack said. If you knew, she might have used it against you. I didn't want to take that risk. Meredith watched the exchange with amusement, her confidence growing. See, you can't even trust your so-called ally. But I'll give you credit, Clara, you're smarter than I thought. Too bad it won't matter in the end. Before Clara could respond, Meredith's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then smirked. If you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to. But don't worry, I'll make sure you're both taken care of very soon. She walked away, leaving Clara and Jack in tense silence. Back in Clara's room, the tension between her and Jack was palpable. You lied to me, Clara said, her voice sharp. Jack shook his head. I didn't lie, I just didn't tell you everything. There's a difference. Clara crossed her arms. Not much of one. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I should have told you sooner. But the truth wouldn't have changed what we're trying to do. Meredith is dangerous, and we're running out of time. Clara wanted to stay angry, but she couldn't deny that Jack had been the only one willing to stand by her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What do we do now? Jack's expression hardened. We finish what we started. Meredith thinks she's untouchable, but everyone has a weakness. We just have to find hers. The following day, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. A team of accountants and lawyers arrived at the house, claiming to conduct a routine audit of the family's finances. Clara overheard snippets of conversation that made her stomach churn. Looks like someone's been tampering with the records, one of them said. It all points to Clara Evans. Meredith played the concerned stepmother to perfection. Oh, my poor stepdaughter. She's been under so much pressure lately. I'm sure there's an explanation. Clara wanted to scream. Meredith wasn't just framing her, she was cementing the narrative that Clara was unstable and untrustworthy. That evening, Clara and Jack reviewed the files they had stolen from Meredith. Hidden among the spreadsheets and emails was a name that caught Jack's attention. K. Blackwell. This is the guy she's been working with, Jack said. If we can find him, we might be able to get him to turn on her. Clara frowned. How do we find someone like that? Jack's lips curved into a faint smile. Leave that part to me. Jack spent the next day tracking down leads, calling in favors from contacts he had made during his years working various odd jobs. By evening, he had a name and an address. K. Blackwell runs a private security firm in the city. Jack explained to Clara. If Meredith's been using him, there's a good chance he knows everything. Clara's stomach twisted with anxiety. And what if he's loyal to her? Jack's expression was grim. Then we'll have to convince him otherwise. That night, Clara and Jack drove into the city. Their destination, a nondescript office building on the outskirts of downtown. The air was heavy with tension as they approached the door. Jack knocked, and a tall man in a dark suit opened it. His piercing eyes scanned them both before he stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the office was stark and utilitarian. A single desk and chair dominating the space. K. Blackwell sat behind the desk, his demeanor calm but intimidating. I assume you're here about Meredith, he said, his voice deep and measured. Clara's breath caught. How much did he know? And was he an Aloha, another enemy? K. Blackwell's presence filled the room with an unnerving tension. Clara and Jack exchanged a wary glance before stepping further inside. I don't like wasting time, Blackwell said, gesturing for them to sit. His sharp eyes flicked to Jack. You've been digging where you shouldn't, haven't you? Meredith's not happy about that. Jack leaned forward, his tone steady. And you've been helping her bury people like me for years. But here's the thing, you're not the only one with leverage now. Clara's heart raced as Jack pulled out his recording device and placed it on the desk. We have proof, Blackwell. Evidence that ties you and Meredith to everything: fraud, embezzlement, even threats. If this gets out, you're done. Blackwell's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. That's a bold assumption. And what makes you think I'll let you leave here alive with that? Clara's voice cut through the tension. Because we're not your real enemy, she said, her words trembling but resolute. Meredith doesn't care about you. The second you're no longer useful, she'll throw you under the bus just like everyone else. Blackwell studied her for a moment, his piercing gaze weighing her words. And what do you want from me? Jack leaned back, keeping his tone firm. We want the truth, all of it. Names, dates, transactions, everything you have on Meredith. Blackwell let out a low chuckle. You think it's that simple? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Meredith Evans is a master manipulator. She's got judges, lawyers, and politicians in her pocket. Bringing her down won't be easy. Clara didn't flinch. We're not asking for easy. We're asking for justice. Blackwell exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers on the desk. You're lucky I hate her as much as you do. He opened a drawer and pulled out a file. This is everything I've got on her. But don't think for a second this makes us allies. If this goes south, I'm not going down with you. Clara's hands trembled as she took the file. It was a treasure trove of damning evidence. Emails, signed contracts, even photographs of meetings between Meredith and high-ranking officials. She always thought she was untouchable, Blackwell said, a grim smile on his face. But everyone has a breaking point. As Clara and Jack left the office, the weight of the file in her hands felt both empowering and overwhelming. This is it, Clara said as they got into the truck. This is what we need to stop her. Jack nodded, his expression cautious. It's enough to blow her world apart, but it's also enough to make her come after us with everything she has. We need to move fast. They decided to meet Robert one last time, hoping he could help them coordinate with the authorities before Meredith had a chance to retaliate. Back at the Evans estate, Meredith was far from complacent. She sensed that Clara and Jack were closer to uncovering her secrets, and her paranoia reached a boiling point. She called her private investigator, a man who specialized in cleaning up inconvenient messes. I need you to find out exactly what Clara and her little friend are planning, she ordered, and make sure they don't succeed. Her investigator nodded, his tone cold. Consider it done. Meredith smiled to herself as she hung up. Let's see how clever you really are, Clara. As Clara and Jack made their way to meet Robert, they noticed a black SUV tailing them. Are we being followed? Clara asked, her voice tight with fear. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Yeah, hang on. He took a sharp turn down a side street, weaving through traffic in an attempt to lose their pursuers. But the SUV stayed close, its engine roaring as it gained on them. Jack, what do we do? Clara cried. Jack's jaw clenched. We don't let them catch us. The chase ended abruptly when Jack pulled into an underground parking garage and killed the engine. They crouched behind the truck, holding their breaths as the SUV idled at the entrance before speeding away. That was too close, Clara said, her voice trembling. Jack nodded. They're getting desperate. We have to act now. When Clara and Jack finally reached the cafe, Robert was already there. But something about his demeanor was off. Robert? Clara asked, sliding into the seat across from him. What's wrong? Robert hesitated, glancing around nervously. We've been compromised. Meredith's people know about our meetings. They've threatened my family, Clara. I can't do this anymore. Clara's heart sank. Robert, please. You're the only one who can help us. Robert shook his head. I'm sorry. You're on your own. He stood and left, leaving Clara and Jack staring at each other in stunned silence. As they sat in the empty cafe, Clara's phone buzzed. Her blood ran cold when she saw Meredith's name on the screen. Taking a deep breath, she answered. Hello, darling, Meredith's voice cooed. I hope you've enjoyed your little adventure, but it's time to come home. We have things to discuss. Clara's hands trembled as Meredith's tone darkened. Oh, and Jack, tell him I know everything. He's not as clever as he thinks. The call ended, leaving Clara and Jack staring at each other in growing dread. The phone call from Meredith hung like a storm cloud over Clara and Jack. As they drove back to the Evans estate, every turn of the wheels felt like marching toward a battlefield, and Clara could barely keep her hands from trembling. She knows, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knows everything. Jack's expression was grim. She's bluffing. She doesn't know about Blackwell or the files we have. If she did, she wouldn't be calling. She'd already be shutting us down. But Clara wasn't so sure. Meredith's cunning had always been razor-sharp, and the threat in her voice was undeniable. When they arrived at the house, the air felt heavy with anticipation. Meredith was waiting for them in the grand sitting room, her posture relaxed, but her eyes cold. Well, there you are, she said, her voice smooth as silk. I was beginning to think you'd run off and eloped. Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. Cut the act, Meredith. We know everything about the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the shell companies. It's over. Meredith's smile widened. Over? Oh, sweetheart, it hasn't even begun. She reached for her phone, pressing a few buttons before turning it toward them. A live feed appeared on the screen, showing two men standing in what looked like a dark storage facility. Between them was Blackwell, his face bloodied and bruised. Clara gasped. What have you done? Meredith tilted her head. I told you, darling, I always know what's going on. And your little friend here made the mistake of thinking he could betray me and walk away unscathed. Jack clenched his fists. Let him go, Meredith. He has nothing to do with this anymore. Meredith ignored him, focusing on Clara instead. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over whatever you've stolen from me, and in exchange, I might consider letting him live. Clara's mind raced. Blackwell's life hung in the balance, but giving Meredith the evidence would destroy any chance they had of exposing her. What's it going to be, Clara? Meredith pressed, her tone dripping with mock concern. Tick-tock. Clara looked to Jack, desperation in her eyes. What do we do? Jack's voice was low but firm. We don't negotiate with her. If we give her the files, she'll kill him anyway and she'll come after us next. Meredith's laugh was cold and cruel. Smart boy. But not smart enough. Before Clara could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A moment later, Thomas Evans entered the room, his expression one of confusion and concern. What's going on here? He asked, his gaze shifting between Clara, Jack, and Meredith. Meredith's expression froze for a split second before she recovered, her voice syrupy sweet. Darling, it's nothing. Clara and her friend were just telling me some wild story about fraud and conspiracies. You know how imaginative she can be. Thomas frowned, looking at Clara. Is that true? No, Clara said, her voice trembling with emotion. Dad, she's lying. She's been stealing from you for years, and she's framing me to take the fall. Thomas's face darkened as he turned to Meredith. What is she talking about? Meredith's mask slipped slightly, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Don't be ridiculous, Thomas. She's just trying to cause trouble because she doesn't want to get married. You know how dramatic she can be. Clara stepped forward, holding up the folder of evidence they'd collected. Look for yourself. This is proof of everything she's done. Thomas hesitated before taking the folder. As he flipped through the documents, his face turned pale. What is this? He demanded, his voice shaking. Meredith, tell me this isn't true. Meredith's facade crumbled, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Oh, grow up, Thomas. You're so naive. Did you really think I married you out of love? You were a means to an end, nothing more. Thomas stared at her in disbelief. You've been lying to me this whole time, Meredith smirked. Of course, I have. And if you had any sense, you'd step aside and let me handle this. Otherwise, you'll end up just like Clara. Before Meredith could say more, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. Clara and Jack exchanged a glance. This was their last chance to stop her. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. It's over, Meredith. The authorities are already on their way. You can't weasel your way out of this one. Meredith's eyes narrowed, her confidence faltering. You think a few papers and recordings are enough to take me down? I have connections, people who will make this disappear before it even hits the news. Clara's voice rang out, clear and resolute. Not this time. You're done, Meredith. Moments later, 2 police officers entered the room, followed by Robert, who looked both nervous and determined. I had to do the right thing, Robert said, avoiding Meredith's venomous glare. The officers moved toward Meredith, who raised her hands in mock surrender. Fine, she said coolly. Arrest me. But don't think for a second that this is over. As they led her away, Meredith shot one last look at Clara. You'll regret this, darling, mark my words. But Clara stood tall, her fear replaced by a quiet strength. Not as much as you will. In the days that followed, the extent of Meredith's crimes came to light. Her network of corruption unraveled, and her once powerful allies abandoned her to save themselves. Thomas, devastated by the betrayal, resigned from his business to focus on rebuilding his relationship with Clara. As for Jack, he prepared to leave town, his role in exposing Meredith complete. You could stay, Clara said one evening as they walked through the garden. There's nothing left to fight anymore. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe not for you. But there are still people out there like Meredith, and someone has to stop them. Clara nodded, understanding but saddened. Thank you for everything. Jack leaned down and kissed her forehead. Take care of yourself, Clara. You're stronger than you think. The once mighty Meredith Evans was led away in handcuffs, her cold composure cracking under the weight of flashing cameras and the murmurs of onlookers. Clara stood on the porch of the Evans estate, watching as the woman who had tormented her for years was finally held accountable. But the sense of victory was fleeting. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the fallout. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said softly. Clara shook her head. We did it. But now we have to deal with everything she left behind. The morning after Meredith's arrest, the Evans estate was a chaotic mess of investigators and reporters. Clara stayed in her room, avoiding the flurry of questions and the prying eyes of strangers. Her father knocked softly before entering. His face was pale, his usually confident demeanor replaced with quiet sorrow. Clara, Thomas began, his voice trembling. I don't even know where to start. I've gone through the documents you gave me, and he trailed off, his eyes filling with tears. I can't believe I let this happen. I failed you. Clara's heart ached for him, despite everything. You didn't fail me, Dad. Meredith was a master manipulator. She fooled everyone, not just you. Thomas sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I let her turn me against you. I let her destroy our family. Clara knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. We can rebuild, Dad, but we have to be honest with each other from now on. No more secrets. Thomas nodded, though the weight of his guilt was clear. Later that day, Clara found Jack in the garage, packing his belongings into his truck. "You're really leaving?" she asked, her voice heavy with emotion. Jack paused, leaning against the truck. "I have to. Meredith's arrest is just the start. There's going to be a lot of fallout, and I don't want to make things harder for you." Clara stepped closer. "You're not making things harder. You've been the only person I could count on through all of this." Jack smiled faintly. "You don't need me anymore, Clara. You've got everything you need to take on whatever comes next." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recording device that had been crucial in taking down Meredith. "This belongs to you now," he said, pressing it into her hand. "It's proof of what you've overcome. Don't ever forget how strong you are." Clara clutched the device, her throat tightening. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." Jack gave her one last look before climbing into his truck. As he drove away, Clara felt both a sense of loss and a spark of hope for the future. In the days that followed, the media frenzy around Meredith's arrest intensified. Clara became an unwitting focal point of the scandal, with reporters hounding her for statements and trying to dig into her past. Finally, Clara decided to confront the storm head-on. With her father by her side, she held a press conference on the front steps of the estate. "I want to start by saying that I had no knowledge of the crimes committed by my stepmother," Clara began, her voice steady despite the sea of cameras before her. "For years, she used her position in our family to manipulate and control those around her. She betrayed my father's trust, and she tried to destroy me to cover her tracks. But she underestimated the power of the truth." Thomas spoke next, his voice choked with emotion. "As a father, my greatest regret is that I didn't protect my daughter from the harm Meredith caused. But together, Clara and I will do everything we can to make things right." The press conference ended with a sense of cautious optimism, though Clara knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. With Meredith gone, Clara began the painstaking process of reclaiming her life. She worked with the authorities to unravel the full extent of Meredith's schemes, testifying against her in court and assisting with the investigation into her accomplices. At the same time, Clara focused on rebuilding her relationships. She reconnected with friends she had lost during Meredith's reign of control, and she began to repair her bond with her father. One evening, as Clara walked through the garden that had once been her refuge, she felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. The shadows of Meredith's cruelty no longer loomed over her, and the future felt like a blank slate waiting to be written. Just as Clara began to settle into her new life, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She hesitated before opening it, her hands shaking as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Dear Clara, congratulations on your victory. But don't think for a second that this is over. You've won the battle, darling, but the war has just begun. Yours truly, Meredith." Clara stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Meredith's words were a chilling reminder that some battles never truly end. The letter from Meredith shook Clara to her core. Just when she thought she could finally move on, her stepmother's chilling words dragged her back into the nightmare. Clara folded the letter carefully and slid it into her desk drawer, determined not to let the threat consume her. But her unease lingered. What did Meredith mean by "the war has just begun"? Was it an empty threat, or did she still have influence even behind bars? The next day, Clara received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Rebecca Torres, a journalist who had been following Meredith's case closely. "I know you're trying to put all of this behind you," Rebecca said, her voice steady but urgent. "But there's something you need to know. Meredith isn't just any criminals. She's part of a larger network, and her arrest has sent shockwaves through powerful circles." Clara frowned, gripping the phone tightly. "What kind of network?" "Political and financial corruption," Rebecca explained. Meredith was just one piece of the puzzle, but she knew how to leverage secrets to keep herself protected. Now that she's been exposed, her allies are scrambling to cover their tracks. "You might think she's powerless in prison, but trust me, she's more dangerous than ever." Clara's stomach churned. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you can help bring the rest of them down," Rebecca said. "And because, if you don't, they'll come after you next." Rebecca's warning proved true sooner than Clara expected. That evening, as Clara was heading back from a meeting with her father's lawyer, A car sped toward her as she crossed the street. Clara barely managed to dive out of the way, the vehicle screeching past and disappearing into the night. Shaken, she scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. When she returned home, Jack was waiting for her in the garden. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his brow furrowing as he noticed her trembling hands. "Someone just tried to kill me," Clara said, her voice breaking. Jack's expression hardened. "It's starting. Meredith's people know you're a threat, and they're trying to silence you." Clara and Jack went through the files from Meredith's empire again, this time looking for connections they might have missed. "Rebecca's right," Jack said, pointing to a series of transactions involving high-ranking officials and corporate executives. "This wasn't just about your family. Meredith was laundering money for some of the most powerful people in the country." Clara's eyes widened as she recognized a name on the list. Senator Graham Collins. A longtime friend of her father's. "No," Clara whispered. "Not him." Jack's voice was grim. "If he's tied to this, it explains why they're coming after you. You're the one person who can expose the whole operation." The next morning, Clara confronted her father about Senator Collins. "Dad," she said, placing the file on the table in front of him. "Did you know about this?" Thomas's face paled as he scanned the documents. "Graham, no, that's impossible. He's one of the most honest men I know." "Then explain this," Clara said, pointing to a series of payments from one of Meredith's shell companies to the senator's campaign fund. Thomas sank into his chair, his hands shaking. "I trusted him. I trusted all of them." Clara's voice softened. "We have to do something, Dad. If we stay silent, we're no better than they are." Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and pride. "You're right, it's time to put an end to this." Clara and Jack worked with Rebecca to devise a plan to expose the network of corruption. Rebecca agreed to publish a series of articles, but only if they could provide undeniable proof that would hold up against the powerful people involved. They decided to use Senator Collins as their entry point. Clara arranged a meeting with him under the pretense of discussing her father's legal troubles. The senator greeted her warmly at his office, his demeanor as charming as ever. "Clara, it's so good to see you," he said, motioning for her to sit. "How's your father holding up?" "He's doing his best," Clara replied, her tone guarded. "But I need your help with something." As they spoke, Jack waited in the car outside, listening through a hidden microphone Clara had placed in her purse. "I need to know the truth," Senator Clara said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "I've heard rumors about Meredith and some questionable connections. My father's been dragged into enough scandal already. I can't let him get caught up in more." The senator's expression tightened, but he quickly recovered. "Clara, I assure you, whatever you've heard is nothing but gossip. Meredith was a manipulative woman, but she acted alone." Clara leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Then why is your name on these transactions?" She slid a copy of the records across the desk. For a moment, the senator's polished facade cracked. "I don't know where you got that," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But if I were you, I'd be very careful about what you say next." As Clara left the office, her heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. She had rattled the senator, but she also knew she had painted a target on her back. When she returned to the car, Jack's face was pale. "What's wrong?" Clara asked. Jack handed her the microphone device, his voice grim. "Listen to this." Clara pressed play, her stomach sinking as she heard the senator's voice. "Clara Evans is digging too deep," Collins said to someone on the phone. "We need to handle this now." The senator's recorded threat played in Clara's mind like a broken record, each repetition tightening the knot of fear in her chest. Jack drove them back to the estate, his jaw clenched in quiet determination. "They're going to escalate," Jack said, breaking the silence. "We rattled them, and now they're desperate. We can't stay here, it's too dangerous." Clara's voice trembled. "Where can we even go? They seem to know everything we do." Jack gripped the wheel tighter. "We need to stay mobile. Keep them guessing while we gather the final pieces of evidence." That night, as they packed essentials into Jack's truck, Clara noticed movement in the shadows near the edge of the property. "Jack," she whispered, pointing toward the figures. Two men dressed in black moved stealthily toward the house, their postures tense and predatory. "Get in the truck," Jack said, his voice low but commanding. Clara obeyed, her hands shaking as Jack climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the men briefly, their startled faces confirming their intent. One of them raised a hand to signal the other, but Jack floored the gas pedal, speeding away before they could react. Jack drove through the night, eventually pulling into an isolated cabin deep in the woods. The air was crisp and still, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. "This place used to belong to a friend," Jack explained as they stepped inside. "It's off the grid, no one will find us here." Clara collapsed onto a worn sofa, her exhaustion catching up with her. "What now?" Jack sat across from her, his expression serious. "We keep the pressure on. Rebecca's ready to publish the first article, but we need something concrete to tie the senator directly to the money laundering." Clara rubbed her temples. "How do we get that? He's not going to hand over evidence willingly." Jack's eyes darkened with resolve. "Then we take it." The next evening, under the cover of darkness, Jack and Clara parked a few blocks away from Senator Collins's office building. Clara's heart pounded as Jack reviewed their plan. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Jack nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we don't get this evidence, they'll keep coming after us." Armed with a set of tools Jack had borrowed from a friend, they approached the back entrance. Jack picked the lock quickly, and they slipped inside, navigating the empty halls with careful precision. Inside the senator's private office, Jack went to work on the locked filing cabinet, while Clara searched the desk drawers. "Jack," Clara whispered, holding up a USB drive she found hidden beneath a false bottom in the drawer. Jack grinned. "That's what we're looking for." As they prepared to leave, a faint beeping sound caught Clara's attention. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized it was coming from a motion detector in the corner. "We triggered an alarm," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Run," Jack barked. They sprinted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing loudly as the sound of distant voices grew closer. Just as they reached the exit, a security guard appeared, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Stop right there," the guard shouted. Jack shoved the door open, pulling Clara through. Just as the guard raised his radio to call for backup, they ran to the truck, adrenaline propelling them forward as they sped away into the night. Back at the cabin, Clara and Jack plugged the USB drive into Jack's laptop. A series of encrypted files appeared on the screen, their labels vague but promising. "This could take some time to crack," Jack said, typing furiously. Clara watched anxiously as Jack worked. After what felt like hours, the first file opened, revealing a spreadsheet of payments that traced directly to Senator Collins's campaign fund. "Here it is," Jack said, his voice tinged with triumph. "This connects him to the laundering operation and Meredith's network." Clara's relief was short-lived. "They'll know we were there. We need to get this to Rebecca before they come for us." As dawn broke, Clara and Jack left the cabin, planning to meet Rebecca at a secure location. But as they drove through the winding forest roads, a black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror. "They've found us," Jack said, his voice tense. The SUV accelerated, ramming into the back of their truck. Clara screamed as Jack fought to maintain control, the tires skidding on the gravel. "Hold on," Jack shouted, veering sharply onto a side road. The chase intensified, the SUV closing the distance with each turn. Desperate, Jack swerved toward a narrow bridge spanning a rushing river. "Jack, the bridge," Clara cried. "We don't have a choice," Jack replied. As they reached the center of the bridge, the SUV rammed them again, sending the truck skidding sideways. Jack slammed on the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a halt inches from the edge. The SUV screeched to a stop behind them, and two men emerged, guns drawn. "Get out," one of them barked. Jack and Clara exchanged a glance, their options dwindling. "Follow my lead," Jack whispered, his hand brushing against the recording device in his pocket. Jack raised his hands as he stepped out of the truck, Clara following close behind. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long," the man said, his gun trained on Jack. "Give us the drive, and maybe we'll let you live." Jack's voice was calm, calculated. "You don't want the drive, you want to avoid a scandal. Killing us won't stop this from getting out. It'll only make it worse." The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What are you playing at?" Jack held up the recording device. "This has everything we need to expose not just the senator, but everyone in Meredith's network. It's already been sent to a journalist." If something happens to us, the whole world will know. The man's grip on the gun faltered slightly, his confidence wavering. You can either walk away now, Jack continued, or you can gamble with your entire operation. The man exchanged a glance with his partner. The tension palpable. The tension on the bridge was suffocating. Clara stood frozen beside Jack, her heart pounding as the armed men exchanged glances. The sound of the rushing river below only amplified the weight of the moment. The lead man tightened his grip on his gun, his finger hovering near the trigger. You think you can threaten us and walk away, he snarled. Jack held his ground, the recording device still in his hand. I don't need to threaten you, the truth is already out there. All I have to do is make one call, and this operation falls apart. The man's partner stepped forward, his voice low but urgent. We can't afford this kind of exposure. If what he's saying is true, shut up. The leader barked, his frustration boiling over. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. You've already lost, she said. The evidence we have won't just expose you, it'll bring down everyone involved. If you hurt us, you'll only make things worse for yourself. The leader's eyes darted between Clara and Jack, his composure unraveling. For a moment, it seemed he might pull the trigger anyway, but then his partner placed a hand on his shoulder. She's right, the second man said. We need to go. The leader cursed under his breath before lowering his weapon. You think you're safe now? He spat. This isn't over. The two men retreated to their SUV, the sound of its engine fading as they sped away. Jack exhaled deeply, the tension leaving his body all at once. That was too close. Clara nodded, still shaken. Let's get out of here before they change their minds. An hour later, Clara and Jack met Rebecca at a secure location, a small, inconspicuous cafe on the edge of town. The journalist's sharp eyes lit up as they handed over the USB drive. This is it, Rebecca said, scanning the files on her laptop. This is exactly what we need to blow this story wide open. Clara leaned forward, her voice filled with urgency. You have to move fast. They know we're onto them, and they're not going to stop until they silence us. Rebecca nodded, her expression serious. I'll publish the first piece tonight. Once it's live, they won't be able to bury this anymore. Jack's voice was firm. Make sure you name everyone. No one gets to walk away from this. Rebecca met his gaze, her determination matching his. Don't worry. By the time I'm done, the whole world will know the truth. True to her word, Rebecca's article went live that evening, and the fallout was immediate. The headline was damning. Network of corruption. Inside the scandal that rocked Washington and beyond. The story named names, detailing the roles of Senator Collins, Meredith Evans, and other powerful figures in the sprawling conspiracy. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and social media erupted with outrage. Clara watched the coverage from her father's study, her emotions a mix of relief and exhaustion. Thomas entered the room, his face lined with worry. You've done something incredible, Clara, but this isn't over yet. Clara looked up at him, her expression weary. I know, but at least now, they can't hide anymore. In the weeks that followed, Meredith's trial became a national spectacle. Clara testified against her stepmother, her voice steady as she recounted the years of manipulation and abuse. Meredith sat stoically throughout the proceedings, her icy demeanor unshaken even as damning evidence piled up against her. But when the prosecution presented the recordings from Jack's device, her mask finally cracked. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict. Meredith was sentenced to decades in prison, her empire in ruins. As she was led out of the courtroom, Meredith shot Clara one last venomous look. You'll regret this, she hissed. They'll come for you next. Clara met her gaze unflinching. Let them. I'm not afraid anymore. After the trial, Jack prepared to leave town once again. Clara met him at the edge of the estate, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves. You don't have to go, Clara said, her voice soft. Jack smiled faintly. You've got this now, Clara. You don't need me to fight your battles anymore. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. I wouldn't have made it this far without you. Jack stepped closer, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. You're stronger than you think. Don't ever forget that. Before Clara could respond, Jack leaned down and kissed her gently. When he pulled away, he whispered, Take care of yourself. As Jack drove away, Clara watched until his truck disappeared from view, the ache of his absence tempered by the knowledge that she could stand on her own. In the months that followed, Clara dedicated herself to rebuilding her life. She enrolled in college, determined to study law so she could help others who had been wronged by people like Meredith. Thomas stepped back from public life, focusing on repairing his relationship with Clara and making amends for the damage caused by his inaction. One evening, as Clara walked through the garden, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The shadows of the past no longer haunted her, and for the first time, the future felt like hers to shape. Weeks later, Clara received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, and her heart skipped a beat as she opened it. "Clara, I wanted you to know that I'm okay. I've started a new life, but I'll never forget what we went through together. You taught me that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way to fight back. You're braver than anyone I've ever met, and I know you'll do great things. Maybe our paths will cross again someday. Until then, keep being the incredible person you are. Yours always, Jack." Clara smiled, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, next to the recording device that had changed everything. The past was behind her, but the lessons it had taught her would guide her for the rest of her life. The weeks following Meredith's trial were a whirlwind of media coverage, legal proceedings, and personal reflection. Clara found herself thrust into the spotlight as a reluctant hero, her testimony against her stepmother inspiring others to speak out against corruption and abuse. But the attention came with its own set of challenges. Reporters camped outside the Evans estate, their cameras clicking incessantly whenever Clara stepped outside. Anonymous threats arrived in the mail, remnants of Meredith's lingering network of allies. Despite these hurdles, Clara remained steadfast. At Rebecca Torres's urging, Clara agreed to a televised interview to address the public directly. Seated across from the host in a sleek studio, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "Clara," the host began, "your story has captivated the nation. How does it feel to know that your bravery has inspired so many?" Clara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't think of myself as brave," she said. "I was just trying to survive. But if my story helps others find the courage to stand up for themselves, then it's all been worth it." The host leaned forward. "What's next for you? After everything you've been through, how do you move forward?" Clara smiled faintly. "One step at a time. I'm going to focus on my education and rebuilding my life. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." The applause that followed felt genuine, but Clara knew the road ahead would be far from easy. Though Thomas was doing his best to atone for his mistakes, the relationship between father and daughter remained fragile. One evening, as they sat in the study, the tension finally came to a head. "I know I've said this before," Thomas began, his voice heavy with guilt, "but I'm so sorry for everything you've been through." "If I had been paying attention," Clara cut him off gently. "Dad, we can't keep going over this. What's done is done. The only thing that matters now is how we move forward." Thomas nodded, his expression conflicted. "I just don't know how to fix this." "You start by being honest," Clara said. "No more secrets. No more letting other people make decisions for you." Thomas reached across the desk, placing a hand on hers. "I promise, Clara, no more secrets." For the first time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope that their bond could be rebuilt. As the media frenzy began to die down, Clara took small steps toward normalcy. She reconnected with her old friends, explaining the events that had kept her isolated for so long. One afternoon, Clara met her childhood friend Emily for coffee. "I still can't believe everything you went through," Emily said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Clara sighed, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. "I didn't think anyone would believe me. Meredith was so good at making me feel powerless." "Well, she underestimated you," Emily said firmly. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Clara smiled, grateful for the support. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. As Rebecca's articles continued to expose the full extent of Meredith's network, several of her former allies faced their own reckonings. Senator Collins resigned in disgrace, his career destroyed by the revelations of his involvement in the laundering scheme. Other prominent figures were arrested or forced to pay hefty fines, their reputations irreparably tarnished. Each headline brought a sense of justice, though Clara knew there were still more people who had escaped accountability. Rebecca called Clara one evening to share an update. "We're making progress," Rebecca said, "but there's still a long way to go. These people are like weeds. You pull one out, and two more pop up in its place." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we keep pulling until the garden is clear." One afternoon, Clara was surprised by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Elaine, the older woman who had warned her about Meredith months earlier. "I just wanted to see how you were holding up," Elaine said, her eyes kind but weary. Clara invited her in, and the two sat in the kitchen, sharing tea and memories. "I never thought anyone would be able to stand up to Meredith," Elaine said. "She always seemed untouchable." "She almost was," Clara admitted. "But she underestimated how much people can endure when they have no other choice." Elaine reached across the table, squeezing Clara's hand. "You've done more than anyone could have asked of you. Don't forget to take care of yourself too." The visit left Clara feeling both comforted and determined. That evening, as Clara was organizing her desk, she noticed an envelope tucked between two books. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, and there was no return address. Opening it carefully, she unfolded a single sheet of paper. The message inside was short but chilling. "You think it's over, but it's not. We're watching." Clara's breath caught. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a cruel joke, but deep down, she knew it was something more. Meredith's allies weren't finished with her yet. Clara sat at her desk, her mind racing. She had fought too hard to let fear take hold again. If they were still watching, she would make sure they saw her strength. The ominous letter weighed heavily on Clara's mind, its message a stark reminder that Meredith's downfall had not ended the danger. She tucked the letter into the drawer, alongside Meredith's prison missive, a silent testament to the battles she had won and the ones still to come. Clara decided to share the letter with Rebecca, who was already investigating the remnants of Meredith's network. Over coffee, at the same cafe where they had hatched their original plan, Clara slid the letter across the table. Rebecca scanned it quickly, her brows knitting together. "This isn't just a threat, it's a warning." Clara frowned. "A warning of what?" Rebecca leaned in, her voice dropping. "That they're regrouping. Meredith's network might have lost its key players, but there's always someone ready to step in and fill the vacuum." After the meeting, Clara reached out to the authorities handling Meredith's case, sharing the letter and her concerns. While they agreed to increase patrols around the Evans estate, Clara knew she couldn't rely solely on them for protection. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Enrolling in self-defense classes and working with a private security consultant to improve the estate's safety measures. During one training session, Clara found herself partnered with a sharp-eyed instructor named Lena. "You've got good instincts," Lena said after watching Clara block a mock attack. "But you're hesitating. Don't be afraid to hit back." Clara nodded, her determination growing. "I'm done being afraid." Meanwhile, Rebecca continued to dig deeper into the remnants of Meredith's operation. Her investigation uncovered a series of new shell companies that had been set up just weeks after Meredith's arrest. Their accounts tied to offshore banks. "Whoever's running this is trying to rebuild what Meredith lost," Rebecca told Clara during one of their calls. "And they're doing it fast." Clara felt a chill. "Do you think it's someone we already know?" Rebecca hesitated. "It's possible. But it could also be someone new, someone who sees an opportunity to take control." Clara clenched her fists. She had hoped the fight was over, but it seemed the battle was far from won. One night, as Clara reviewed notes for an upcoming class, she heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering downstairs. Her heart leaped into her throat as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported the break-in. Grabbing the pepper spray she had started keeping in her bedside drawer, Clara crept down the stairs, her pulse racing. In the dim light of the living room, she saw a figure rummaging through the desk where her father kept important documents. The intruder was dressed in black, his face obscured by a mask. "Stop right there," Clara shouted, her voice steadier than she expected. The figure froze, then turned toward her, his movements deliberate and menacing. Before she could react, the sound of sirens filled the air, their flashing lights spilling through the windows. The intruder bolted, disappearing through the back door just as the police arrived. The officers searched the house but found no sign of the intruder. Clara sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she recounted what had happened. "It doesn't make sense," she said. "They didn't take anything valuable. They were looking for something specific." One of the officers nodded. "We'll increase patrols in the area, but I'd recommend staying with a friend or family member for a while." Clara shook her head. "I'm not running. This is my home." The officer hesitated, then handed her a card. "Call us if you remember anything else." After they left, Clara contacted Rebecca, recounting the incident in detail. "They weren't just looking for anything," Rebecca said. "They were looking for something connected to Meredith's operation. Do you have anything left that could implicate them?" Clara thought of the USB drive and the files she had given Rebecca months earlier. "Nothing they don't already know about," she said. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Feeling the weight of the danger closing in, Clara decided to reach out to Jack. She hadn't spoken to him since his departure, but she knew he would understand the threat better than anyone. When Jack answered the phone, his voice was both surprised and concerned. "Clara, what's going on?" Clara explained everything: the letter, the break-in, and Rebecca's discoveries. Jack listened intently, his tone growing more serious with each detail. "I was hoping this was over for you," Jack said. "But it sounds like they're trying to rebuild faster than we expected." "What should I do?" Clara asked. Jack's voice softened. "Keep your guard up. You've already shown them you're not an easy target, but that also makes you a bigger threat. If they think you're close to exposing more, they won't stop until they've silenced you." Clara swallowed hard. "Will you help me?" Jack was quiet for a moment before answering. "I'm on my way." When Jack arrived at the Evans estate the next day, Clara felt an unexpected sense of relief. He was still the same Jack Holm, focused and fiercely protective. "We need to figure out what they're after," Jack said, as they reviewed the details of the break-in. "Whatever it is, it's worth enough for them to take this kind of risk." Clara frowned, her mind racing. "There's one place we haven't looked: Meredith's old storage unit. She kept a lot of personal files there before the trial." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And you think there's something they missed?" "It's worth a shot," Clara said. Jack nodded. "Then let's go find out." Later that evening, Clara and Jack arrived at the storage facility, their nerves on edge as they unlocked the unit. The space was as Clara remembered, filled with neatly labeled boxes and a faint smell of dust. They began searching methodically, opening files and flipping through documents. At first, it seemed like there was nothing of significance. But then Clara uncovered a locked metal box tucked beneath a pile of old papers. Jack pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a stack of photographs, letters, and a ledger. Clara's eyes widened as she scanned the contents. "This is it. This is what they've been looking for." The ledger contained detailed records of transactions that hadn't been included in the files they'd already exposed. It listed names, dates, and amounts that tied Meredith's network to even more powerful figures. But before they could celebrate, the sound of footsteps outside the unit made them freeze. "Someone's here," Jack whispered. They exchanged a tense glance as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever was coming wasn't here by accident. The footsteps outside the storage unit grew louder, deliberate, and unhurried. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she and Jack exchanged a silent glance, their shared urgency palpable. Jack motioned for her to stay back as he reached for the crowbar he had used earlier. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their own breathing. Clara clutched the ledger tightly, her mind racing. The names and transactions inside the box could dismantle what remained of Meredith's network, but it also made them targets. Whoever was outside knew that. The door creaked open slowly, and two men stepped inside, their faces partially obscured by baseball caps. One carried a flashlight, its beam sweeping across the boxes, until it landed on Clara and Jack. Well, one of the men drawled, his tone mocking. "Looks like we found the snaps." Jack stepped forward, the crowbar held loosely in his hand. "You're making a mistake. Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." The second man laughed coldly. "You think you're in a position to make threats? Hand over the box, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." Clara's voice cut through the tension. "You think we don't have backups? Copies of everything in here are already with the press." The men hesitated, their confidence faltering. The first man narrowed his eyes. She's bluffing. Try me, Clara shot back. Jack seized the moment, swinging the crowbar at a stack of metal shelves. The loud crash sent the men stumbling back, giving Clara and Jack just enough time to bolt past them and out of the unit. Clara and Jack sprinted through the maze of storage units, their footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridors. Behind them, the sound of angry shouts and pounding feet spurred them on. This way, Jack shouted, leading Clara toward an emergency exit at the far end of the facility. As they burst through the door and into the night, the cold air hit Clara like a shock. Jack scanned the parking lot, spotting their car parked a short distance away. Go, he urged, pushing Clara ahead of him. They reached the car just as their pursuers emerged from the building. One of the men raised a gun, its muzzle flashing as a shot rang out. Clara ducked instinctively, her heart racing as Jack shoved her into the passenger seat. He climbed in after her, slamming the door and starting the engine in one fluid motion. The tires screeched as they sped out of the lot, leaving the men behind. Once they were safely back at the Evans estate, Clara and Jack locked the doors and drew the curtains, ensuring they couldn't be easily watched. Jack placed the metal box on the dining table, his expression grim. Whatever's in here, it was worth risking their lives and ours. Clara opened the ledger again, flipping through the pages slowly. The names listed were a who's who of political figures, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials. This is bigger than anything we found before, Clara murmured. These are people in positions of power, people who can manipulate the system to protect themselves. Jack's jaw tightened. Not anymore. We're going to make sure this gets out. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. We need to get this to Rebecca. The next morning, Clara and Jack met Rebecca at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. They showed her the ledger, watching as her eyes widened with each page she read. This is explosive, Rebecca said, her voice tinged with both awe and apprehension. If we publish this, it'll take down half the city's elite. That's the point, Clara said. Rebecca hesitated. You realize what you're asking, right? These people won't just sit back and let this happen. They'll come after all of us. Jack leaned forward. They already have. Clara's life is on the line, and they won't stop until they think she's no longer a threat. The only way to stop them is to expose the truth. Rebecca sighed, her expression conflicted. Give me a few days to go through everything. If I'm going to publish this, I need to make sure it's airtight. Clara and Jack agreed, but as they left the diner, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. That night, Clara received a phone call from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. Clara Evans. The voice on the other end said, smooth and familiar. I'm disappointed. I thought you'd be smart enough to walk away. Clara's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? The voice chuckled. Let's just say I was a friend of your stepmother's. And unlike her, I know how to clean up a mess. Clara's blood ran cold. If you think you can scare me, scare you. The voice interrupted. No, Clara. I'm going to erase you. The line went dead, leaving Clara shaking with a mix of fear and determination. Clara turned to Jack, her voice trembling but resolute. They're coming for me, Jack. We need to act now. Jack nodded, his eyes blazing with determination. Then let's make sure they regret it. The two spent the night preparing the evidence for release, backing up the files on multiple devices and sending copies to trusted allies. Clara felt a surge of resolve as she realized how far she had come from a powerless girl under Meredith's control to someone ready to take on an entire network of corruption. This is it, Clara said, as she hit send on the final email to Rebecca. No more hiding. Jack smiled faintly. You've come a long way, Clara. Rebecca's article, bolstered by the new evidence, went live the following week. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Arrests were made across multiple states, and those who had once seemed untouchable were finally held accountable. Though the fight wasn't over, Clara felt a sense of closure. She had faced her fears and stood up to forces far greater than herself, and she had won. As she walked through the garden one evening, the cool breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers, Clara allowed herself to smile. The shadows of the past were fading, and the future was hers to shape. Months had passed since the final article had been published, and the world seemed different to Clara Evans. Meredith's arrest and the exposure of her network had sparked a chain reaction. with public protests, political reforms, and sweeping investigations into corruption. Clara, once the quiet girl, living in her stepmother's shadow, now found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't intended to lead. People reached out to her from all corners of the country, victims of injustice, survivors of abuse, and even those who had once been part of Meredith's schemes, but now wanted redemption. Her name had become synonymous with resilience, but Clara still wrestled with the scars left by her ordeal. One chilly autumn evening, Clara stood backstage at a university auditorium. The room was packed with students, activists, and community leaders who had come to hear her speak. Rebecca, who had become both a mentor and a friend, adjusted Clara's microphone. "You ready?" she asked with a reassuring smile. Clara took a deep breath, as ready as I'll ever be. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was overwhelming. She smiled nervously, scanning the crowd before beginning. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the butterflies in her stomach. "When I was younger, I didn't think I had a voice. My stepmother made sure of that. She taught me to doubt myself, to believe that no one would ever take me seriously. But what I've learned is that even in the darkest moments, even when it feels like the world is against you, there is power in truth. There is strength in standing up and saying, 'Enough.'" The audience hung on her every word as she recounted her journey, from the oppressive control of Meredith to the triumph of bringing her down. By the time she finished, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Clara felt a swell of pride, not for herself, but for the lives her story might inspire. Back at the estate, Clara and her father worked to rebuild their lives, focusing on honesty and transparency. Thomas sold off the parts of his business that had been tainted by Meredith's schemes, redirecting the proceeds to charities and organizations dedicated to combating corruption and supporting survivors of abuse. One evening, as they reviewed plans for a new foundation they were establishing, Thomas looked at Clara with a mix of gratitude and regret. "You've become an incredible woman," he said. "Your mother would be so proud." Clara smiled, her heart aching at the mention of her late mother. "I think she would have told me to keep fighting." "And you have," Thomas said. "More than I ever could have imagined." Despite the victory, there was one chapter Clara had yet to close. She knew she needed to confront Meredith one last time, not for answers, but for herself. She arranged a visit to the prison where Meredith was serving her sentence. The sterile environment, with its cold grey walls and harsh fluorescent lighting, felt a world away from the opulence of the Evans estate. When Meredith was brought into the visitation room, she looked different, thinner, her once perfect hair now dull and unkempt, but her eyes still held the same calculating gleam. "Clara," Meredith said, her voice icy, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Clara sat across from her, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I came to tell you that I forgive you." Meredith's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "You forgive me?" Clara nodded. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. You don't control me anymore, Meredith, and you never will again." For the first time, Meredith seemed at a loss for words. Clara stood, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she walked out of the prison, she felt an overwhelming sense of closure. That evening, Clara returned home to find another letter waiting for her. This one bore Jack's familiar handwriting. She opened it eagerly, smiling as she read his words. "Clara, I've been keeping up with everything you've been doing, and I couldn't be prouder. You've shown the world what it means to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Things are calmer for me now. But I haven't stopped looking for people like Meredith, people who think they can take whatever they want without consequences. You've inspired me to keep going. Maybe one day, I'll stop running and find a place to call home. Until then, know that you'll always have a friend in me. Yours always, Jack." Clara folded the letter carefully, her smile bittersweet. Jack's absence left a void, but his words reminded her of how far she had come, how much further she could go. The Evans Foundation officially launched on a brisk winter morning. Its mission clear: to fight corruption and support those who had suffered under abusive power. The event was held in a modest but elegant venue downtown, attended by community leaders, activists, and survivors who had been inspired by Clara's story. Standing at the podium, Clara felt a rush of emotions: pride, determination, and a lingering hint of nervousness. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but it was one she had chosen to carry. "Today isn't just about my story," Clara began, her voice steady. "It's about all of us. About creating a future where no one has to endure what I endured, and where those who abuse their power are held accountable." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy fueling Clara's confidence. As she stepped down from the stage, Thomas greeted her with a warm smile. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. Clara smiled. "This is just the beginning." After the event, Clara met with Rebecca, who had been working tirelessly to follow up on the loose threads of Meredith's network. "I hate to interrupt your celebration," Rebecca said, sipping her coffee. "But there's something you need to know." Clara frowned. "What is it?" Rebecca slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, documents, and transcripts of conversations that hinted at a new player rising from the ashes of Meredith's operation. "They're calling themselves the Consortium," Rebecca explained. "A group of former allies and new opportunists. They're not as organized as Meredith's network was, but they're dangerous all the same." Clara felt a pang of exhaustion. Will this ever end? Rebecca's gaze softened. "You don't have to fight this alone. The Foundation gives you a platform, and people are ready to stand with you." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll face them together." Later that evening, Clara walked through the estate's garden, her sanctuary, in the chaos. The moonlight illuminated the frost-covered roses, their resilience a quiet reminder of her own journey. As she paused by the fountain, her thoughts drifted to Jack. She could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, urging her to keep moving forward. "You'd tell me not to let this break me," Clara murmured, a faint smile on her lips. "And you'd be right." The sound of footsteps behind her broke her reverie. She turned to see Thomas approaching, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more in the past year than most people do in a lifetime," he said, joining her by the fountain. "But you don't have to carry this weight alone." Clara sighed. "I know. But sometimes it feels like I'm the only one who can." Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've shown people what's possible. That's all anyone can ask. The rest, you'll figure out as you go." Clara nodded, comforted by his words. The next day, Clara received an unexpected visitor. Elaine, the widow who had first warned her about Meredith. "Elaine," Clara said warmly, inviting her inside. "I wasn't expecting you." "I heard about the Foundation," Elaine said, her tone proud, "and I thought you might need some help." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Help?" Elaine smiled knowingly. "I spent years navigating the same circles Meredith did. I know how these people operate. If someone's trying to rebuild what she lost, I can help you find them." Clara hesitated, surprised by the offer. "Are you sure?" Elaine nodded firmly. "It's time I stopped running, and I can't think of a better cause than this." With Elaine's insights and Rebecca's relentless investigation, Clara began to strategize for the next phase of her mission. The consortium's emergence was troubling, but it also presented an opportunity to expose corruption on an even larger scale. Clara and her team focused on building partnerships with other organizations, creating a network of allies who could stand together against the new threat. One evening, as they reviewed plans in the Foundation's modest office, Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a rare smile on her face. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd see the day when Meredith Evans's empire was just a memory." Clara smiled faintly. "It's not gone yet, but it will be." Just as Clara prepared to leave for the night, her phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line read, "A friend's warning." Curious, she opened it. The message contained no text, only an attachment. When Clara clicked on it, a document appeared, a single page listing dates, names, and transactions that linked the consortium to international operations. Her heart raced as she realized the implications. Whoever had sent the email had access to critical information and they were trying to help her. But why had they stayed anonymous? And how much more did they know? Clara stared at the screen, her determination renewed. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone. The cryptic email dominated Clara's thoughts as she worked late into the night. The attachment was a goldmine of information, revealing names, financial transactions, and even locations tied to the consortium. Yet the sender's identity remained a mystery. Jack's words from his letter echoed in her mind. "You've inspired me to keep going." Clara wondered if he could be behind the email. The timing was uncanny. But she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Whoever the sender was, their information could give her the upper hand. The next morning, Clara contacted Rebecca, forwarding her the email. "This could be exactly what we need," Rebecca said, her tone cautious. "But we need to verify it before we act on it." "Can we figure out who sent it?" Clara asked. Rebecca nodded. "I have a few contacts who specialize in cybersecurity. Let me see what I can do." While Rebecca worked on tracing the email's origin, Clara focused on the contents of the attachment. Many of the names listed were unfamiliar, but one stood out: Marcus Hall, a powerful real estate developer who had been a quiet backer of Meredith's ventures. "I remember him," Clara muttered, flipping through old news articles about her stepmother's dealings. Marcus had been at several of Meredith's events, always staying in the background, never drawing too much attention to himself. It was time to bring him out of the shadows. As Clara prepared to confront Marcus, Rebecca called with an update on the email. "You're not going to believe this," Rebecca said. "The email was routed through multiple servers to obscure its origin, but we managed to trace it back to a small town in Montana." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Montana. That's where Jack said he was heading." Rebecca hesitated. "You think it's him?" Clara considered the possibility. Jack had always been resourceful, and the email's contents were exactly the kind of thing he would uncover. "I need to find out," Clara said. Before leaving for Montana, Clara decided to confront Marcus. Using Elaine's connections, she arranged to attend a charity gala where Marcus would be present. Dressed in a sleek black gown that belied her nerves, Clara entered the grand ballroom, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on him. Marcus was standing near the bar, his demeanor confident and composed. Clara approached him with purpose, her voice steady. "Marcus Hall." He turned, his expression briefly flickering with recognition, before he forced a polite smile. "Yes, and you are?" "Clara Evans," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "I think you know who I am." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder. "Ah, Meredith's stepdaughter. I've heard about your efforts. What brings you here tonight?" Clara leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "We both know Meredith's empire didn't end with her arrest. I have proof that you're part of the consortium." Marcus's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Clara held his gaze unflinching. "Walk away now, Marcus. Cut ties with them, or you'll end up like Harrotting in a cell." He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're in over your head, little girl." Clara smiled faintly. "We'll see." As she turned to leave, she caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes. A few days later, Clara found herself on a plane to Montana. She had reached out to Jack's last known contact in the area, a former co-worker who had hinted at his whereabouts. Arriving in the small town nestled against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, Clara felt a sense of both excitement and trepidation. What would she say to Jack if she found him? And what if he wasn't the one who sent the email? Following the co-worker's directions, Clara drove to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots as she approached the door. She knocked twice, her breath visible in the cold. Moments later, the door opened, and there he was, Jack, looking both surprised and relieved to see her. "Clara," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What are you doing here?" Clara explained everything: the email, the names, and the growing threat of the consortium. Jack listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a laptop. "I wasn't sure if you'd figure out it was me," he admitted, a faint smile on his lips. Clara's eyes widened. "It was you," Jack nodded. "I've been following the consortium's movements since I left. I didn't want to pull you back into this, but when I found that ledger, I knew you were the only one who could handle it." Clara felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, frustration, and a renewed sense of purpose. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Jack sighed. "Because I didn't want to drag you into more danger. But I should have known you wouldn't back down." Clara smiled. "You were right about that." Together, Clara and Jack began strategizing their next move. With the information Jack had gathered, and the resources of the Evans Foundation, they had the tools to dismantle the consortium piece by piece. But Clara knew this was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight to protect everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. As they mapped out their plan, Clara felt a renewed sense of determination. Meredith's legacy would not define her, and the consortium would not silence her. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt ready to face whatever came next. Months later, Clara stood before a packed room at the Evans Foundation's annual gala. Jack stood in the back, a quiet but steady presence. As Clara addressed the crowd, her voice carried the weight of her journey. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. Together, we've shown that no matter how powerful the forces against us may seem, they can be brought down by the truth." The applause was deafening, but Clara's focus was on the future. Her story was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop fighting.